The Adventure of the Interchanged Key. Written by Petr Macek, music by Daniel Barták, read by Jamie Marshall. I must grant significant, perhaps even the most significant merit for the fame and reputation of my friend Sherlock Holmes to my esteemed publisher, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It was he who managed all my publication efforts, be they in journals, magazines, or books. Alongside Holmes, he was my first critic, advisor, editor of all our adventures, and it was he who often helped me select the great detectives' cases even before I began writing, so as to choose those that would appeal to and surprise the public with a sufficiently original plot. I always get chills when I realize how many excellent literary crime stories were shelved due to secondary circumstances. The social or political context of the time, the need for concealment in the interest of the security of the British Empire, or simply because the persons involved did not wish for them to be publicized. I did, however, manage to deal with the latter issue by slightly altering the circumstances and the names, and sometimes even the dates and locations, enough to ensure that the real persons would have no reason to be upset, while preserving a proper depiction of Holmes's procedures without detracting from his deductive abilities. Mr. Doyle supported me in this amendment of the truth, driven naturally by his interest as a publisher. There is no need to ruin a good story with excessive realism, he often assured me, while we were seeking ways to publish some sensitive document or other. I was therefore surprised by the utterly different attitude he assumed when, for once, he himself was at the center point of our investigation. At the time, he was determined that absolutely nothing about the affair should come to light, for a publisher of respectable literature cannot afford similar embarrassment, and it might even be detrimental to my own work. But much water has passed under the bridge since then. Today, so many years later, I see no reason not to commit my memories to paper, especially as this adventure is indeed among the most curious. A murder among the ranks of detective novel writers certainly seems so to me. Late one evening, around the turn of the century, Holmes and I were disturbed in our rooms by a messenger who would not be denied entry, claiming that he had an urgent missive from Mr. Doyle himself. Besides the hour, which did not suggest a work issue, the fact that the otherwise distinguished gentleman would choose this form of communication unsettled me. In the handwritten note, he asked whether Holmes and I would come immediately to the address of a hotel in Lambeth. Given the tone and the speed at which he must have scribbled the message, I suppose it must be something urgent, the detective observed after briefly examining the note. His writing is shaky. The individual words are barely in a straight line, and he even misspelled something. Yet instead of rewriting the message, he simply crossed out the mistake. There is no doubt Mr. Doyle is greatly distressed. Holmes took very little convincing. While we dressed hurriedly, the waiting messenger hailed a cab, and we were soon dashing through Mayfair and Belgravia towards Lambeth Bridge over the Thames. I would have thought your scribbling earned rather more money. The hotel Doyle summoned us to is not amongst the finest. Indeed, I would expect to find someone of the lower middle class there, he pondered, as the carriage meandered through the thinning traffic. To the best of my knowledge, my publisher's offices were located somewhere entirely different, nor was his private residence anywhere in the vicinity, so I merely shrugged. The impertinent remark concerning my writing fees, which had never been the chief source of my income, I chose to overlook. Unfortunately, I did share my friend's surprise as to what Doyle could be doing in a place such as this. I couldn't avoid the suspicion that the respectable gentleman may have let himself go with a young lady, found a love nest in a cheap hotel, and something had happened. I could sense a scandal brewing. Having arrived on the spot, we found our assumptions to be correct. It was a shabby brick building with dusty windows, most of them drowning in darkness. In only a few, a faint light shone from behind heavy curtains, attracting moths. The pavement was empty. We stepped quickly inside and past the abandoned reception desk, with a bell on the counter and a sign indicating that the receptionist was available on call. This came as little surprise. It was indeed a place where it was advisable not to check who was coming and going. Better not to see or hear them. We headed upstairs on the worn red carpet to the room whose number the messenger had given before disappearing. Mr. Doyle was not in the company of a young lady, but rather a man. He was lying, prostrate, on the floor in the middle of the room, quite dead. The cause of his demise was undoubtedly the splinter fracture at the crown of his skull, which was bleeding profusely. Had I been called as a doctor, we would have arrived too late. The expression on my face must have been full of questions. Doyle, waiting for us on a chair near the writing desk beneath the darkened window, rose instantly and blurted out an answer to the most crucial of these. "I didn't kill him," he said firmly, but with visible concern. "I found him like this." The good old soul who conveys my work to readers was a heap of misfortune. Attired in a tweed suit with a green cravat and snowy white collar, he looked quite out of place in the drab room considering the circumstances. "With all due respect, I've heard countless assurances of the kind in my career, not all of them based on the truth. Please do allow me to judge for myself freely and without prejudice," Holmes retorted, rather unfeelingly. But gentlemen, we know each other intimately. Why, Doctor, you cannot possibly believe," Doyle gasped. "It is of no consequence what we believe, but what the clues and evidence lead us to," the detective interrupted him, preventing me from rushing forward to reassure my friend. Even he remained standing just inside the door so as not to trample on any clues, systematically scanning the room with his gaze. "What have you touched in here?" "Nothing," the publisher proffered. "As soon as I stepped in and saw what had happened, I called for a messenger and passed him the note for you through a crack in the door. Not even he knows why I sent for you. Good grief, this could ruin me." "Allow me to correct you," my friend chided him briskly. "At the very least, you touched the pen, the pad of paper, the chair you're seated on, and the door handle and the door frame." Doyle's large twisted moustache, protruding to both sides, drooped suddenly, with sweat beaded on his lofty brow. He began muttering something, but Holmes cut him off with an annoyed wave of the hand. "Your behaviour was far from exemplary for a publisher of detective stories," he uttered. Holmes stepped towards the publisher and grasped his palms in his own. Had the latter interpreted this as a gesture of apology or assurance, that would all be well. He was quite mistaken. My friend drew Doyle's hands up close to his face as though to kiss them, and started examining them minutely, even taking out his obligatory magnifying glass for assistance, and topping off this performance by sniffing at the skin. "I say, I must protest!" the suspect exclaimed indignantly. "If you desire my help, you'll have to endure my methods," the detective retorted, proceeding to roll up Doyle's jacket sleeves. Only then was he satisfied. "I believe you," he added more gently. "What was that charade supposed to mean?" "I had to be certain," Holmes explained. "Nevertheless, I admit that your perfectly manicured hands committed no violent crime, at least not in the past several days. Nor do your spotless cuffs bear any traces of blood, which would have been an inevitable consequence of so brutal an act." The detective motioned towards the dead man. "Why, the murderer would not have sent for you himself." "You might be surprised," reacted the detective with a mysterious expression, but he did not elaborate on his remark. Instead, he turned his attention to the victim. "I suppose you know the poor fellow?" I asked Doyle, while Holmes examined the corpse. "Can you tell us who he is?" The publisher nodded. His name was Fred. He worked for me in my publishing house. I was to collect a finished order here tonight." "A writer?" "Not at all. Fred was a book doctor." I had never heard the term before. "The man was a doctor," I said, bemused. Doyle shook his head. "In our business, a book doctor is someone who analyzes manuscripts and pinpoints why they do not work and how to improve them," he explained. "Be it to your credit, Dr. Watson, that you have never encountered one. But we publishers often employ them, albeit I have yet to meet a writer who would admit it. Imagine the blow to their ego, struggling with a manuscript that simply refuses to come out right. A book doctor could often salvage it. You'd be surprised how many of today's bestsellers and famous authors owe their successes to the intervention of just such anonymous helpers as Fred here was. I could hardly be surprised that Doyle would not receive such a person at his office, but instead met him somewhere where they would not be seen. It had to remain a secret, as did the illusionary genius of Doyle's authors. Then my supposition that Fred's death is directly linked to his occupation need not be entirely outlandish." "It certainly doesn't look like a random robbery," Holmes said, raising his eyes from the corpse and gazing at the murder weapon. I too had noticed it immediately upon our arrival. The large, heavy, black Remington typewriter could barely be overlooked. The dead man was lying in a pool of blood not far from it, one cramped arm still outstretched to the keys, as though he had attempted to continue working until his last breath. Doyle frowned. Writers may be vain, but in the end, they have the final veto. Neither Fred nor I enforced any interventions in their work. If they insisted on disregarding Fred's amendments, the worst thing that could happen would be that they would have to take back their manuscript and offer it to another publisher. I can see no motive for murder here. My own experience with Arthur Conan Doyle was quite the same. We had often argued over certain changes to my texts, but he never pressed me to accept them, and our collaboration was based on dialogue. "What commissions was Fred currently working on?" Holmes inquired. The publisher hesitated for a moment, but when we promised not to divulge which of his promising authors required such uncharacteristic assistance, he relented. Fred was working on 2 manuscripts, one for a successful author of women's novels, Miss Yvonne Fairchild. The second, an adventure novel by Adam Zambalista. Adam is one of the mainstays of our publishing house. Even I had heard of this young author, although I was not among his readers. All the same, successful novels set amongst the European aristocracy allegedly offered just the right mix of historical fact, romantic suspense, intrigue, and subterfuge. Sadly, in recent months, Adam seemed to be struggling with some form of writer's block, and Fred, quite literally, plucked a thorn from his side with fresh ideas in his last book, Doyle added. One might entertain the idea that Adam had wanted to get rid of a witness to his disgrace, but that would require killing several other people who are privy to the matter, including myself. Besides, Adam is on the verge of completing another novel, and I don't know how he will manage without Fred. Even if I were to concede that Adam could be capable of such a thing, which I don't believe he is, the murder would work against him. The detective made no comment on Doyle's deduction and turned the man's body onto its back. He was rather a handsome man with Slavic features, fair hair and a moustache. His lifeless blue eyes now fixed rigidly on nothing. "Hello, hello," Holmes suddenly rejoiced over the corpse. A long fair hair was curled around the dead man's trouser leg. My friend grasped it carefully and held it up to the light. "Undoubtedly a woman's, freshly washed and curled," he concluded. "I hate to admit it, but Miss Fairchild has blonde hair," the publisher said grimly. "Whose manuscript was Fred supposed to turn in today? Which one did you come to collect?" "Lily, made in Piccadilly." Doyle blushed, muttering something to the effect that romance novels had seen unprecedented commercial success in recent years. "What is Miss Fairchild's physical constitution?" continued the detective, shifting his attention to the murder weapon. "It would take considerable strength to lift such a typewriter, which weighs many pounds, and strike someone over the head with it." "If it were a murder in the heat of the moment, even a slight person can exert surprising abilities for a short period of time," I said, searching for a possible explanation. "She is of slight stature," the publisher admitted haltingly, "but I have seen her angry before, and have no desire to experience her spewing fire again." From my point of view, everything fell into place beautifully. I should think that if we pay a visit to Miss Fairchild's home, everything will be quite clear. Surely she won't deny it for long, and will tell us what happened here and why, I proposed, imagining that in the end the investigation would not be very difficult, and I might hope to get to bed at a decent hour. The bells outside were already striking midnight, the time when a gentleman pours his last glass of sherry. Yet Holmes seemed disinclined to leave. "Perhaps," he murmured. What could still be on his mind? "How long has Fred been in your employ?" he asked Doyle after a while. "Several years now." "What do you know of his personal life? Where's he from?" "He was not a gregarious man," admitted the publisher. "Truth be told, I know very little about his past. He was recommended by an editor from the Strand, and his skills and willingness to remain silent were more important to me, so I never really inquired. He had an accent I couldn't place, but he was certainly not a Londoner." Holmes scratched his chin and looked around again. "Speaking of which, where is the novel then? You said you hadn't touched anything." The publisher threw up his hands. "There is no manuscript here. I don't know where it is." "Nor do I see any papers. There is nothing in the basket or in the typewriter." Holmes surveyed the bloodied machine once more with his magnifying glass. Curious. Even the typewriting ribbon is gone. Fred could have not removed it because his fingers would have been covered in ink, which they are not. The perpetrator must have done it. The lady most likely simply took the manuscript with her, Doyle suggested. Surely we will find it at her home, which will only serve as further evidence. Yet the detective continued to stall. Watson, do you not find the position we found it in suspicious? You mean the arm might stretch to the typewriter? I understood what he was suggesting. He nodded. Fred seems to have lived for a few moments after the blow. He was writhing. Perhaps in the delirium caused by the brain contusion, he attempted to reach for the typewriter and type a message. But before escaping, the culprit preventatively removed any paper from within reach of the prostrate body and took out the ink tape for good measure. Look, there is a small scrap left in the paper holder where the murderer tore it out. But he didn't bother with a notepad on the desk, being quite sure that the fatally injured and dying man would never reach it. Why didn't he simply take the typewriter away? Dragging off a heavy machine is far more laborious than simply taking out paper and tape. Or perhaps he wanted to avoid making more noise. Or he may have been disturbed. Or she had no strength left, remarked Doyle, turning attention back to the lady writer. It is starting to look more like premeditated murder than a spur-of-the-moment crime, I exclaimed. It may be a combination of both. The killer acted on impulse, but once the crime was committed, he or she started covering their tracks. The detective finally admitted what seemed most probable to Doyle and me. We had encountered many charming angels of death before today. A pity that the murder was so cold-blooded and thought of everything, I sighed. Holmes, still examining the typewriter, grew alert. Perhaps not everything, he hissed excitedly, peering at the Remington again through the magnifying glass. He removed the tape, but the second ink will give us a clue nonetheless. Doyle and I looked at each other quizzically. What ink? I ventured to ask, dreading the answer. Blood, Watson. Fred pointed at his killer with his own blood. From my vantage point, the entire keyboard of the typewriter seemed spattered with blood. I remarked this to my friend, who gave me his usual compassionate look, the one he reserved for those moments when he found me particularly inept. Yes, it is precisely because the machine is covered in blood that we can read the keyboard well, like a book. Fred's fingers are likewise covered in blood, which I initially ascribed to his having touched the wound. But I think he was reaching for the typewriter and grasping at the keys. He was unable to put anything to paper, but was trying with all his remaining might to press a single key. In doing so, he smudged the drop of blood on it. As always, Holmes was right. How could I have missed it? One letter on the splattered keyboard was partly smudged. It was the Y key. Yvonne Fairchild had clearly failed to think of that. Doyle rubbed his face wearily. Well then, good heavens. Gentlemen, act as you see fit, but in the strictest confidentiality, I beg you. Above all, no press. I will attempt to have a statement ready by morning. No need to hurry yet. The detective restrained him. Before I have Miss Fairchild arrested, I will need two more things. The first is an older manuscript that Fred had worked on previously. Surely you'll have some at your office, he asked the publisher. Furthermore, your contract with Fred, which I'm sure bears his initials and may give me some answers. Ideally, if you could get both immediately and have them delivered to me at our suspect's address, Watson and I will make our way there in the meantime. She is most likely the murderer, but if Mr. Doyle wishes to avoid a scandal, do you think we would be received without a fuss at this time of night? I objected. It is Friday, my dear friend. Holmes laughed. And you are the only artist I know who goes to bed before midnight. And if indeed you are right, Miss Yvonne will have plenty of adrenaline in her blood after the murder and will not retire to bed any time soon. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, only too glad to leave the room of horror, obediently departed, as did I and the detective, but not before locking and thoroughly sealing off the room and waking the night porter in the cubicle behind the reception desk. The drunken wretch had not even noticed us moving around the hotel, let alone having any inkling of what had occurred upstairs. After a brief interrogation, which merely affirmed our suspicion that he had not seen anybody come in or out of the building, Holmes ordered him not to let anybody into Mr. Fred's room on any pretext until we or the police patrol returned. We then carried on to Miss Fairchild's quarters, which were fortunately also located in central London. My friend had been correct in assuming she would not be asleep. On the contrary, there was a party on at her luxurious home. Indeed, we had very little trouble getting inside. The butler opened the door, and despite our ordinary clothes, he assumed we were among the invited guests. In artistic circles, appropriate attire is not so great a matter of concern. The drawing room was bathed in white light from crystal chandeliers, and there was loud music mingled with the throaty laughter emanating from dozens of exuberant guests at the height of entertainment. In the midst of a group of gentlemen, mostly in coat-tails, stood a petite lady, some years past her prime, dressed in a black sequin dress with an ostrich feather woven into her swept-up hair. Holmes lost no time in joining the group. He laughed theatrically at some witticism or other, then kissed the hostess's hand and asked her for a word in private, where I joined them. Her initial confusion being unable to place our faces and instead pretending we were acquainted to avoid a faux pas, turned into indignation as soon as she found out we had intruded on her soirée as strangers. "Gentlemen, I cannot fathom what sort of impertinence has induced you to such an outrageous act," she fumed. "You will see soon enough, madam, and I am sure will forgive me, but I must ask you a few questions. Know that we are here on official business, and it is very urgent indeed." Miss Yvonne seated herself gracefully in a leather armchair in her study and invited the detective to ask his questions. I observed her expression when he told her of Fred's death, but her surprise may have been merely a well-studied act. "Before I carry on, I should warn you that Mr. Doyle has confessed to us the nature of your cooperation with Fred, so there's no need to conceal anything," concluded Holmes. Miss Fairchild raised her eyebrows and took a long drag from her pearl-tipped cigarette. "I see," she said. "I do hope I can rely on your discretion. As long as you answer truthfully, you have nothing to fear." I wondered why my friend was conducting the interrogation with such tact and waited anxiously to see what would come of it. In his place, I would have been done with it in a heartbeat. "Did you visit Fred at his lodgings today?" "I won't deny it. It was an appointment arranged some days ago." "Because of your manuscript?" "Well, naturally. Why else? They may still title me as Miss, but I am of an age where I am far more interested in my begonias than pleasures of the flesh. I had to smile at her self-deprecation, which I found appealing. What state was the manuscript in? Untouched. Fred told me that he hadn't even started working on it yet, she shrugged. He said that he would inform Mr. Doyle to the effect later today. He apologized, saying I should not take it personally, but that he had made a personal decision concerning his career and would no longer have time for my texts. What decision was that? He didn't say. Inwardly, I delighted in how cleverly Holmes had extracted the motive for murder from the woman. Did you kill him? Holmes asked directly. Are you mad? Why would I do that? I wished him good luck. You took your manuscript with you? Yes, it's here somewhere. She motioned her hand with the cigarette towards the polished wooden bureau. I haven't yet decided what to do with it. I shall consult Mr. Doyle. Might I see it? Miss Fairchild made no objection, opened the drawer, and handed my friend a stack of densely lettered sheets. I'm not sure it's your type of reading. He gave them a cursory glance. One must not be disdainful of anything. I need to borrow one sheet. May I? I assume you wrote all of them yourself. Why, certainly. They were written in this room on a typewriter locked in the cabinet. Would you like to see it? She offered in undisguised sarcasm. That will not be necessary at present, the detective thanked her, folding a single sheet into his pocket. We won't detain you from your company any longer. I wish you a pleasant evening. We bid a polite farewell to the aging miss and allowed ourselves to be shown out. I followed Holmes, who was quite calm, out of the house, utterly consternated that he hadn't arrested her or even accused her of the murder. He seemed to believe her. As if on cue, Doyle's carriage, bearing a sleepy assistant, drew up in front of the building to deliver an envelope with the documents the detective had requested. He opened it swiftly and perused the papers. Ha! Just as I expected, he exclaimed with satisfaction. Watson, we can now make an arrest. Relief washed over me. We were acting on certainty after all. But instead of returning to the house, Holmes stepped into the carriage, waiting for me to follow. I don't understand. Are we not going to arrest Miss Fairchild? You just said that we are going to make an arrest, but not Miss Fairchild. I never really suspected her. Come now, you could be in bed soon, he urged me impatiently. I promise to explain everything in minute detail later. He ordered the coachman to drive us to the address of Adam Zemballista. I sat stunned in the carriage, striving to put together the fragments of all I'd seen to fit Holmes's conviction that Zemballista was the murderer. I had failed to keep up with his logic throughout most of our friendship, but was often able, retrospectively, to sort many things out in my mind. Not this time. And yet, it was elementary, my dear Watson, said the detective, amused by my reticence, which he rightfully attributed to the chaos in my head. When you have two suspects, and one can be eliminated with absolute certainty, then it must be the other one. But all the evidence pointed to Yvonne Fairchild, did it not? You mean the hair, he suggested. She admitted to having been there. The missing manuscript, no mystery there. She simply took it with her. Unlike you, I only found evidence to show she could not have done it. Think along with me, my dear chap, he challenged. I waited anxiously for his speech. Firstly, the blow to Fred's head, he began. Fred was considerably taller than Miss Fairchild, and the blow struck at an angle which simply does not correspond to her stature, regardless of any emotion. He was killed by somebody of at least equal height. It was not your good Mr. Doyle. Secondly, you know only too well how difficult it is to wash off typewriter ink when you stain yourself. You have been struggling with it ever since I have known you. The killer handled the ink tape, which is impossible without leaving stains. When I kissed Miss Fairchild's hand, I couldn't find the slightest trace of ink. I could go on, but I had at least one counter-argument. And how do you explain the smudged blood on the Y key? You concluded yourself that Fred was attempting to identify his killer. Y for Yvonne. What else could it be? There's no Y in the name Zemballista. This did puzzle me for a few minutes, the detective admitted. But this, too, has a simple explanation. Indeed, it is confirmed by Mr. Doyle's reports, he said, handing me the envelope. I opened it and perceived several pages of another manuscript and Fred's contract. To understand what I'm getting at, allow me a brief excursion. Holmes settled into the carriage seat across from me. The layout of letters on typewriter keyboards has a fascinating history. Originally, the sequence of keys was not uniform on all typewriters. But in the last roughly 20 years, manufacturers have standardized what is known as the QWERTY arrangement, according to the order of the keys from left to right on the first row of the keyboard. It was only in 1888, at a convention of experts in Toronto, that this layout was declared universal. And therein lies the rub, he said, preparing to lay out his trump card. Although Fred had a perfect command of the language of Shakespeare, that is, English, indeed so good that he could write it, he was originally from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. According to his contract, his name was Fred Hammerschmidt, a Viennese Bohemian whose native tongue was German. And there it is. German typewriters have one sole difference in their layout. The Y and Z keys are interchanged. In German text, the letter Z occurs more frequently, and therefore it has a more exclusive position. Before coming to England, Fred had learned to type on a QWERTZ, Quartz, keyboard. I smacked my palm against my forehead. At death's door, with an injury to his brain, he must have subconsciously switched to his mother tongue. He automatically reached for the letter Y, but he meant Z. I added, Z for Zemballista, his killer. Quite so, Holmes confirmed. I proceeded with his conviction, but it took me some time to find a motive. Now, however, I am quite certain of it. In a moment, we shall find out whether I was right or wrong. Adam Zemballista confessed almost forthwith. We found him at home in a state of nervous breakdown, his hands stained not only with ink, but also with blood. Nor was Holmes mistaken about the motive. While still in the carriage, he outlined his reasoning, which was incited by Miss Fairchild. Fred was indeed planning to change his occupation. No longer wanting to be an anonymous shadow, he yearned for recognition and his own name on the covers of books. Just as he returned the manuscript to Yvonne, he had returned Zemballista's, who had been drawing not only on Fred's ideas, but on his knowledge of the European noble families he wrote about. The mistake that had cost Fred his life was to boast to Zemballista about his own new work. The jealous and embittered author, who would thereby have lost the only chance of retaining his reputation and the financial reward that went with it, lost control and murdered his rival on the spot in a fit of rage, stealing the manuscript at the same time. For in Zemballista's study we found not only the manuscript Fred had returned, but another brand new one. Despite Zembalista's name emblazoned on the title page, he could not have been the author, as demonstrated by Holmes through a comparative analysis of the 3 manuscripts he had gathered that evening. Every typewriter has a unique cast of letters, which have minor flaws and discrepancies. No 2 typewriters make the same imprint, he instructed me. Doyle gave me an old manuscript that Fred had retyped on his machine. It is identical to the one Zimbalista had hoped to pass off as his own. His authentic work, like that of Miss Fairchild, was demonstrably written on an entirely different typewriter. It was a long time falling asleep that night, and for the next several months, I once again recorded our adventures the old-fashioned way, with a fountain pen.